By the 16th century, the Catholic Church was the only real authority in Christendom. It stamped its authority and kept its authority by having only Latin Bibles allowed in Western Europe. The only people who could read Latin? The priests, and therefore everybody else had to rely upon them for their translation and interpretation of the Bible. The Catholic Church exploited its authority by selling indulgences. In Catholic theology, there are three parts to the afterlife. There's heaven, hell, and in the middle, purgatory. Everyone goes to purgatory for a certain amount of time, but if you buy an indulgence from the Catholic Church, you can reduce that amount of time. The amount of money you spend on an indulgence determines the amount of time reduced in purgatory. Needless to say, the Catholic Church became incredibly wealthy. But today we're going to focus on an Augustinian monk who, in the 16th century, was about to spark a revolution in Europe. The monk's name? Martin Luther. As the likely mythological story goes, on the 31st of October 1517, in the town of Wittenberg, the young monk posted 95 theses, arguments, on the church door. These theses were arguments against indulgences, one of the planks of Catholic fundraising. And Luther's attacks were ultimately condemned by the Pope himself. Over the next few years, Martin Luther really made a name for himself, publishing an immense number of pamphlets. In fact, publishing became Wittenberg's main economic function. His main point in these pamphlets was to argue that Christianity was not about acts, not about indulgences, but about faith alone. Luther argued that faith alone leads to salvation, and this argument, he said, is equivalent to the same one made by Augustine, and before that, the same one, if you remember, made by Paul. Luther was eventually called to meet the bishop Cajetan, and Luther went along, expecting, in Dermot MacCulloch's terms, to have an argument about theology. Cajetan, on the other hand, was expecting to have an argument about authority. How dare this young monk challenge the Catholic Church? And so the two, frankly rather reasonable men, fell out irrevocably. Martin Luther made his way back to Wittenberg, where eventually he read a papal bull, a declaration, warning him that he would be excommunicated if he didn't change his views. In front of the townspeople of Wittenberg, Luther set a fire and dropped the papal bull into it. An act of sheer defiance that, in the time, would have almost certainly led to his death. Heretics, just like the papal bull, were burned. And in 1521, Martin Luther was excommunicated and declared a heretic. Remarkably, Luther was given one more chance, and a trial was called to be judged by the King Charles V in the city of Worms. Charles guaranteed Luther safe passage, and so in April 1521, Luther made the journey. At the trial, Luther was accused of heresy, a heresy that Pelagius had also been accused of over 1,000 years beforehand. The heresy, deceptively using the Bible. Luther, faced with a threat to his life, was having none of it. Here's what he said at the trial. "I am bound by the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything." I think, unsurprisingly, Luther was excommunicated. He was declared a heretic. And as he left Worms, he left with the safe passage of Charles V, but also as an outlaw. He had to make his way back to Wittenberg with all possible speed. He didn't get very far before armed knights appeared and abducted him. Luther on his way back to Wittenberg had completely disappeared. Luckily for Luther, it was Friedrich III, the Elector of Saxony, who had abducted him. And being a subject of Friedrich III, he was under his protection. And so, Luther spent many months in Wartburg Castle, disguised as a knight, so that Catholic spies would not be able to hunt him out and burn him at the stake. Luther, essentially a social creature, was isolated and depressed. He searched around desperately for a project, and the project he found was significantly controversial. If you thought that damning indulgences, the main source of Catholic revenue, was controversial, wait until he took on the authority of the Church itself. Remember, the Catholic Church claimed its authority by having the Bible only in Latin, and therefore requiring priests to interpret it for the common people. Well, Luther changed all that. In that castle in Württemberg, he translated the Bible from its original Greek into the common tongue of German. He democratized theology so that everybody, highborn or low, could read the Bible for themselves and interpret it also for themselves. What began as Luther's revolution now became the much more widespread Reformation. It completely changed the way that authority worked in Europe. The Catholic Church didn't have authority, but then neither did Luther. Everybody had the Bible for themselves and could interpret it, therefore, for themselves, which of course meant that there were radically different interpretations. The poor, for instance, noticed something interesting in the Bible, that the rich, they can't get into heaven, and so they wanted to help them out by taking that money. This culminated ultimately in the Farmers' War of 1525. A disaster. Those who took part on the side of the farmers were butchered, and Luther, terrified of what would happen to him, condemned them. I think this means one thing in particular, that the Reformation, whilst a spiritual liberation, was not, in Luther's view at least, a liberation in terms of social order. So it was up to the elite of Europe to stand up to the Catholic Church now, and they did so. In 1529, 6 German princes signed a letter of protestation against the Catholic Church, and thus the movement known as Protestantism, to protest, was born. But not just in Germany, in England also. In 1534, in England, the King Henry VIII, seeking a divorce from his wife, and refused it by the Catholic Church, got Parliament to excommunicate themselves from the Catholic order and declare a new church, the Church of England, of which, of course, Henry VIII was the head. A new form of Protestantism in both Germany, known as Lutheranism, and in England, known as the Church of England, was born, and Catholic power in Europe was, at the very least, fundamentally divided. There were many other offshoots of Protestantism. For instance, the Anabaptists, who claimed that you ought to be baptized much later in your life and not indoctrinated as a baby. Another tenet of Catholic authority rose up, especially in the city of Münster, where they established a rather radical religious movement there that was eventually overrun by the Catholic Church in brutal fashion. And another example would be John Calvin, who argued that there was no such thing as free will at all, and instead everybody was either destined from birth to heaven or hell. Radical interpretations throughout Europe of the Bible and of theology generally, all resulted from that first set of theses that Martin Luther pinned to that church door in Wittenberg, but much more importantly, to the translation of the Bible that Luther had done in that castle disguised as a knight. A whole new realm of thinking was now available to the average person in Europe, and Catholic authority was slipping. This was the beginning of the democratization of theology, but also of thought more generally.